I would like to read you something I've been working on. It's called Double Wrong, a story about a community under pressure, the moment they finally cry out, and what deliverance looks like, rough edged and complicated. Story 1, Double Wrong. Shadows of the Way, a judge's anthology. The Spirit of the Lord came upon them, and he judged Israel and went out to war. The record as kept. Chapter 1, The Forgetting. This is how they told it later, the ones who remembered. They said the forgetting happened slow. It didn't announce itself. There was no day you could circle and say, this is when we quit the Ancient of Days. Cold moved in instead, quiet at first, then steady, until the place you lived in changed and you couldn't remember the feel of it any other way. One morning the hearth was dead, the ash was old. You had walked past it for weeks without thinking to lay a hand on the brick. They told it to their children this way. First, the camp meeting stopped drawing the numbers they used to draw. This was in the first bad winter, when the company cut wages and the men were working 6 days instead of the 3 and coming home too tired to wash, let alone walk 3 miles down the creek to the revival tent. No blame for the men. They were tired. The meetings got smaller and then smaller. The preachers who came up from the valley found thinner and thinner crowds each time and eventually found other valleys to preach in. Valleys where the collections were better and the coal company had not yet arrived. Then the singing went out of the houses. Some of it was simple exhaustion. Some of it was the way a room changed when it stopped being used for anything but sleep. A hush moved in, thick, practical, the kind that kept you from wasting breath. The old song stayed in people, but like names you haven't spoken in years, still there, living somewhere back in the mind, waiting for a moment that never seemed to come. Then the prayers got shorter. The before meal prayers, the bedtime prayers, the morning prayers, the older ones had said since before they could remember saying them. They got shorter, and then perfunctory, and then not stopped exactly because he didn't stop. That felt like a decision you'd have to account for. Reduced to the form of prayer without the substance of it. Words said in the direction of the Ancient of Days, while the mind was already on the next thing. The obligation met, the conversation not had. That was the forgetting. It happened by inches and seasons, grain by grain, until the ridge was a different shape. 8 years in, the hollows had the quality of places where something had been and wasn't anymore. You saw it best in the older faces, the look of people who had been carrying something a long time and had set it down somewhere in the house and couldn't now remember which room they left it in. Chapter 2. Double Wrong. His name was Cushion. The double wrong part was what they called him in the hollows, but not to his face or to the faces of his men. A name like that didn't arrive all at once. It accrued one act, then another, until the sum of it overflowed any single word, and the people reached for 2. Cushion Double Wrong, said soft and meant hard. He came from the valley between the 2 rivers, 2 counties over and down off the ridge. Different country from the hollows, different air, different quality of light. The 2 rivers valley was flatter and richer, with bottomland that grew tobacco and corn without the argument the hollow gardens required, and the men of the 2 rivers carried themselves like men who had never had to work uphill. The hollow men noticed. They always noticed. Cushion came up out of the 2 rivers valley in the 3rd year after the company arrived, and he came with papers. The papers said what the company owned, more than the hollow people had understood it to own, and what the hollow people owed for the use of it, considerably more than they had been paying. He had a man beside him who read the papers aloud, while Cushion stood and listened with the expression of a man who already knew what they said and was waiting for you to know it too. Some of the hollow men tried to read the papers themselves. The papers were written in the language of another country, the language of lawyers and county seats, of people who lived in flat places and wrote things down and kept what they wrote down. Buildings the hollow people rarely entered. The men could tell the papers meant something, but couldn't tell exactly what. By the time they had walked 3 miles to the nearest person who could explain it, Double Wrong's men were already in the next hollow. He was not a large man physically. This surprised people who had never seen him. The reputation was of something massive. He was middle height and lean, with a face like something left out in the weather until the soft parts were gone. His eyes were gray and steady and assessed everything with the flat efficiency of a man for whom the world was composed entirely of assets and liabilities. He came through the hollow twice a year, spring and fall, the collection. The hollow people sensed his approach before they saw him. Air that felt wrong, animals wound up, a tension that made even the dogs go quiet the day before. The hollow people noticed this and didn't say it aloud, because naming a thing gave it edges. He rode a black horse. The horse was well kept, better kept than the hollow horses, better fed. It moved down the hollow road easy and sure, like the grade and the rain didn't have a vote. In the hollows, easy meant power, and you could see the hollow man's shoulders tighten as he went by. He collected methodically. He had a ledger, and the ledger was kept in pencil, and the pencil entries were precise. Amounts, dates, what was owed and what was paid, and what the difference was carried forward. He kept the ledger himself. He did not hand it to a man. The ledger was his. What made him double wrong was this. He was wrong in his taking, and he was wrong in his believing. The taking was the visible part, the papers, the company, the twice-yearly collection that left the hollows lighter than they could afford to be. This was a wrong with a legal skeleton, something you could imagine challenging through the county seat if the county seat had been different than it was, if Double Wrong's men hadn't been in it. The taking was documented and specific. The terms were falsified in ink and treated as truth because they were written down. The believing was the part underneath. The older hollow people sensed it before they could explain it. Bone knowledge, like weather coming. It was not a thing they could fully name. They spoke of it in fragments, the kind you woke with after a bad dream and tried to hold on to it before daylight burned it off. That the Two Rivers Valley had a night air the hollow county. That the Two Rivers Valley had a night air the hollow country did not have. An air the older ones called unclean and the younger ones called unease, and the animals answered by going quiet. That Double Wrong's ledger, when Ott had seen it up close once in the second year, had something in the binding that was not leather. That the collection money went somewhere that was not the company account, not entirely. That some portion of it went further south in the Two Rivers Valley, and nobody had followed to see where it ended. The older ones said he served something. They said it quiet. They didn't say what. They sent their children inside when Double Wrong's men came through the hollow. They kept the older prayers and the older protections, the ones from their grandparents' time, that the revival preachers had said were superstition, but which the hollow people continued. 8 years of it. 8 years of small extractions that added up until the hollow felt light in the wrong places. And then in the 8th year, the sound changed. The prayer came up out of the road like water finding an old channel. Chapter 3. Ott Kenez. Ott had been farming the south-facing slope above Kenez Creek for going on 12 years, the first 4 before Double Wrong arrived and 8 after. He was Caleb's nephew, which in the hollow country meant something. Large, long-bearded, Old Testament in his bearing, the sort of man who quoted the book from a memory without making it feel like a performance, because for Caleb it wasn't a performance, it was how he talked. The book was the language he thought in. Some men thought in numbers. Caleb thought in scripture. Caleb had homesteaded the Upper Hollow 40 years ago and raised his children there and had given his daughter Aksha to Ott Kenaz after Ott had done the thing at Deber. The thing at Deber was what Hollow people called it. Deber was the company's records office and the county seat. Not a grand building, just a frame house converted for the purpose, with filing cabinets along every wall and a clerk at the front who did not look up when you came in. Deber was where the papers lived, deeds and contracts and accounts and correspondence, the paper architecture of what Double Wrong claimed to own and what the company claimed to be owed. In the second year, before the collection had fully established itself, before the Hollow people arrived at the collective resignation, 8 years produced, Ott walked 3 miles to the county seat road and then 8 miles into the courthouse district, and he went in on a Tuesday morning when the clerk was at lunch and the door was unlocked. Information that had taken him 3 Tuesdays of watching to confirm. He went alone. He came back with copies of certain documents, not taken, copied his own hand into the ledger book he'd brought, sitting at the clerk's desk for 2 hours with the door unlocked behind him and the knowledge that the clerk's lunch never lasted longer than 2 hours and sometimes less. He copied them out in a precise, careful hand trained by 8 years of schooling and hardened afterward by hollow self-education, learned from the book and from whatever scraps of the world came his way. The Hollow's best reader had spent a week with the copies. At the end of the week, she had said, the company does not own what the papers say it owns. The deeds are flawed. There are 2 sets of records, and they contradict each other. That contradiction is deliberate, the predictable result of filing one document in the proper office and a different one at the county seat, assuming no one would ever put them side by side. Nothing had come of the Deber documents in any legal sense, but Caleb had seen what Ott did and understood what it meant. Not the legal question, which Caleb was too old to expect to be resolved in his lifetime, but the character question, which Caleb had been watching Ott answer since he was a boy. He gave Ott his daughter, Aksha. He gave them the south-facing slope above Kenaz Creek, the best watered ground in the upper hollow, the land with the spring on it. Aksha was the better half of the marriage, and both of them knew it. She was straight-spoken, shaped by a childhood spent watching her father say exactly what he meant and deciding that was how serious people behaved. She had her father's biblical reference, but deployed at closer range, with a precision Caleb's broader fire and thunder sometimes lacked. She had been the one in the first years of Double Wrong's collection who kept Ott from doing something with his good left hand that would have gotten him put in the ground. She had said, not yet. He had heard the yet and taken it as a promise, not deferral. He had waited. 8 years could stretch a man. He was 34 in the 8th year. He did not look depleted. He was built for the work, and the work had built him. Wide through the chest and shoulders, with the hands of a man who had been doing hard things with them for a long time. But there was something in the eyes that hadn't been there before, a quality of having stopped expecting something. Not despair, the specific look of a man who has put something away in a high place and stopped reaching for it because the reaching costs more than he had to spend. Aksha watched this and kept her own counsel. She prayed every morning with her hands flat on the table, the way she learned from Caleb, said the Psalms in the evening and waited. And then the calendar rolled back to spring again, and the hollow knew what was due. Chapter 4, The Crying Out. It was a woman named Dora who started it. She was 60 years old, and she had 3 grandsons, and she lived in the lower hollow. And she had been paying Double Wrong's collection for 8 years, and had been mostly quiet about paying, as the hollow had been mostly quiet, because that was what the hollow did now, quiet being the posture they had all arrived together, without deciding on it together. The spring collection came in the 8th year, and Double Wrong's men took the seed corn. The seed corn, not the harvest corn. The portion kept back for the next planting. The men came through the lower hollow and took what they could carry, and then took what they shouldn't have known to take. When the lead wagon went past Dora's gate with 3 families seed cord, When the lead wagon went past Dora's gate with 3 families seed corn piled on it, she stepped out and stood there in the road light, shoulders squared, and said, full voice thrown upward to the ridge air, "How long?" That was all. The words landed with no decoration. How long was what people said to the Ancient of Days when they had no leverage left, no language except the old language. The Hollow people still had it in them, solemn language, camp meeting language, kept down in the bone even after 8 years of quiet. The words echoed once in her own mind, as if the Hollow itself were repeating them back to her. Doris stood at her gate for one more breath, watching the wagon's tailboard disappear around the bend, and then she turned and went back into her house like she hadn't just thrown a match. It hung in the hollow air like smoke. The Hollow heard it through water and timber and shared air. Sound traveled in a creek bottom. It slid along the road, rode the water, got caught under porches and rafters, and carried itself into the next house without needing permission. And after Dora's 2 words came a silence the Hollow recognized as new. The old silence had been a closed room. This one was the hush after a window goes up, air moving again, dust shifting in a shaft of light. By nightfall, every creature in the Hollow had heard Dora say, "How long?" Some of them had said it themselves before, privately, in the form of a thought they hadn't put into words. Hearing it said aloud did something different than the private thought had done. The private thought was a stone at the bottom of a well. The words said aloud in the Hollow's air were the stone dropped, the sound of it, and then the ripples. That night, the Hollow people came out. First a few, then more, until the road held them shoulder to shoulder. Nobody chaired it, nobody called it. They simply arrived, and standing there remembered the old use of a voice. Prayer came up out of them like water finding a seam in rock. Rough at first, then steady. It had volume. It had need. It had that low place in it the book called crying out, because crying out was what it was. They prayed in the road, in the dark, boots in the dust, breath showing when the wind came out of the ridge. Some of them wept. The ones who had stopped crying a long time ago cried hardest, because the spring had been sealed and was now unsealed. And what came out first was what had been building since it sealed. Ott stood in the road with Aksha's hand in his right hand. He did not weep. He kept his eyes open and watched the ridge line cut the stairs. He did not weep. He kept his eyes open and watched the ridge line cut the stars, the tree line black against the sky. He prayed plain, the way a man prayed when he'd run out of performance and was left with whatever was underneath. 8 years had scraped him down to that place. It might have been an emptiness, it might have been honesty. He offered it and waited to see what the Ancient of Days did with it. He said, "We forgot. I forgot. I am saying now that I know we forgot, and that I am not going to pretend we didn't. The seed corn is on the wagon. Dora's grandsons have nothing to plant. We are asking." He stayed there after the words, shoulders tight, listening for anything that might answer them. 3 days later, something found him at the creek. Chapter 5, The Creek. He went down to the creek early, before Aksha was awake, in the gray before sunrise. He did this most mornings. The creek was where he thought, where he had always thought, the sound of moving water being the sound his mind worked best against. He went barefoot in the summer, and the creek stones were cold under his feet, and he stood in the shallows and looked at the water moving the stones in the early light. Downstream, the stones were burning, enough that the creek's own sound changed. He watched it for a full breath before his mind found the only word it had, burning. A wide orange glow was coming up out of the creek bed 50 yards downstream. The color of heat pushed past flames into something whiter and harsher. Water ran down over the hot stones and made a low hiss that braided itself into the ordinary creek sound until the creek sounded like it was whispering through clenched teeth. And then, as if he had always been part of the bank and Ott's eyes had only just learned to see him, a man was there. He was standing on the bank downstream, right where the burning stone water began. Light pooled around him, and the stones near his feet carried it. His feet were on the grass, and where they touched, the bank was scorched in two precise circles, burned down to the soil. Everywhere else, the grass held its morning dew. The contrast was exact. His eyes, when he looked at Ott, were the color of the stones. Ott held himself still in the cold water and kept his eyes on the man, like you watched a storm cloud. The man said, "The Ancient of Days has heard the road." Ott did not know what this meant, and later, telling it, he said he had understood it immediately, that the road was what the hollow was, the road the people traveled, the road the collection wagon used, the road Dora stood beside when she said, "How long?" The road where the hollow cried out in the dark. The Ancient of Days had been on the road with them, had heard it. "What am I to do?" Ott said. The words came out flat. The man's eyes stayed on Ott, steady, unblinking, giving him the uneasy sense of being measured without hurry. Then he said, "You know what Caleb's land needs. You have known for 8 years what double wrongs men are and where they come from and how the Two Rivers road runs. You have the documents from De Beer." Ott said, "I couldn't make the documents work in a county seat." "The county seat is not where they work," the man said. He didn't expand on it. Ott would tell it later as a frustration and a mercy at the same time. That the stranger at the creek didn't hand him a checklist. He handed him a sentence that left no room to keep negotiating. It put weight on the next step, and Ott felt it in his bones. The man said, "Go, I will be with you." The glow collapsed back into ordinary rock, and the creek went back to being only a creek. When Ott blinked, there was only dew and smoke and an empty bank. Ott stood in the shallows a long time, feeling the cold of the water on his feet and the early sun beginning on his face, looking at the two scorched circles on the bank where the grass was still smoking faintly, curling at the edges like paper. He went back up to the bank and home through the wet grass, ate because his body demanded it, and then told Aksha the whole thing while the coffee cooled between them. Aksha listened to the whole account with her hands flat on the table, eyes on him with the steady focus you give a man who had just walked in from the weather. When he finished, she didn't reach for comfort or argument. She said simply, "I've been waiting for you to go to the creek." Ott stared at her for a moment, as if the sentence had shifted the room. "How long have you been waiting?" he asked. Aksha didn't blink. 8 years, she said, and the number landed between them like a weight they had both been carrying and never named. Chapter 6. The Spirit. He did not go immediately. He took 3 days and made them count. He brought the De Beer documents back out and laid them open. He walked the Two Rivers road in his mind until he could feel the bends of it in his feet. He spoke to the hollow men who had fought before and might fight again, and he did not sell them anything. He told them what he meant to do and what it would cost, and the men who said yes said it with a particular steadiness of men who had decided to stop lying to themselves. He talked to Caleb, who received him in the upper hollow at the kitchen table with the book open in front of him, as it always was. Caleb listened to the whole account, the creek, the man at the ford, the burned marks in the bank, without interrupting, which told Ott that Caleb recognized what he was hearing. When Ott finished, Caleb was quiet for a moment. He put his hand flat on the open book. Caleb was quiet a moment longer. His hand stayed flat on the open book. Then he said, "The Ancient of Days has been waiting longer than you have." He didn't lift his eyes when he added, as if he were reading it off the page, "Your left hand remembers what to do." He spoke in the book's register, plain, final, as if the matter had already been settled somewhere higher than the Two Rivers Valley and lower than Ott's fear. It wasn't prediction, it was a diagnosis. Double Wrong's arrangements were 8 years old. The Ancient of Days was older. What remained was the doing of it, the ford, the 12 men, the left hand, the 3 days of preparation. Ott nodded once. "Yes, sir," he said. It meant it. "I hear you." He left Caleb's house and walked back down toward his own, the morning air tasting like iron and wood smoke. On the 4th day, the spirit of the Ancient of Days came on Ott, Kenaz. He was standing in the road above the hollow in the early morning, looking south toward the Two Rivers Ridge when it arrived. He had been there 10 minutes, maybe, just standing in the light with the creek behind him, and the hollow still quiet on either side. He understood afterward that he had been waiting. In the moment, he only knew he was still. Later, he described it with the only vocabulary he trusted, his body. He said it was like every lamp in the house coming on at once. The light didn't hurt. It didn't shout. It simply filled the rooms. Something in him that had been running half lit for years rose to full current. In the space the 8 years had carved, the space where expectation used to live was occupied again. He was awake, wide awake, awake in a moment, awake in a way that pointed somewhere. He stood in the road and let it come and did not resist it and felt the circuit close. For 8 years, he'd held three kinds of weight. Paper weight in the De Beer copies, road weight in his knowledge of the Ford and the branches, and the private weight in his left hand. What it remembered and what he kept from using. When the Spirit came, all that weight found its center. The separate burdens stopped fighting each other. They became one errand. He understood it suddenly and completely, and with no sense of having invented it. He looked south at the ridge and felt the decision settle in him like a tool finding its place in the hand. "All right then," he said, and it sounded less like agreement than like stepping off a porch. He went inside and picked up his hat. Aksha was there at the stove with her back to him. She didn't turn around. "Be careful," she said. Ott paused at the threshold. "Pray." From the stove, she answered, steady as cast iron, "I will be doing nothing else." He stepped into the road and took the southbound grade. Chapter 7. The War. Ott did not fight double wrong in a courthouse. He had tried it that way first. De Beer copies, careful argument, the decent man approach of walking it through the front door and trusting the right papers in the right hands. The paper never reached the right hands. Double wrong had men in the county seat. The sheriff, 2 commissioners, a few clerks who smiled and filed things exactly where they were, never to be found. The system was quiet, efficient, and closed. Double wrong's men had papers and badges. The hollow men had the ridges. The hollow men knew the ridges like they knew their own hands. They knew which creek crossings held in flood, which ones lied in drought, and which ones changed personally in that in-between season when mud made truth hard to read. They knew the Two Rivers road split into 2 branches, and they knew which each branch was for. The wagon branch in the fall when the roads were road heavy, the outrider branch when the man came up light and quick. They knew the order of the stops. They knew the habits. 8 years of paying attention while pretending not to had produced in the hollow men a thorough knowledge of what they were being made to endure. The Spirit in Ott did what fire did to wax. It made the shape show. The road knowledge that had lived in him as instinct clicked into something usable. Cushion's Ford came forward in his mind with its steep banks and its narrow throat. The one crossing that held even in spring mud. And he saw, with a sudden clean certainty, how a man who knew those banks could make them decide a fight. He took 12 hollow men and he went to Cushion's Ford 3 days before the collection wagon was due. They held the ford in silence and let the morning come to them. Caleb had said, "Your left hand remembers what to do." Ott felt the truth of it in the weight of his own arm. The years hadn't dulled that hand. They had packed it tight, winter tight. Nothing wasted, nothing soft. He had kept it sheathed for 8 years. At the ford, he let it be what it was. Double wrong came up the Two Rivers road on a Tuesday in the early fall. He came the way he always came, the black horse, the ledger, 6 men, the wagon. He came with the ease of long practice, the ease of a man who had made this trip 16 times and found no reason to expect the 17th to be different. He came to the ford, and the ford looked the same as it had looked 16 times before. The shallow crossing, the steep banks, the creek moving along the stones. At the waterline, the horse hesitated. It was small, one wrong beat in a routine. Then the wagon wheels found the stones, and the creek sound changed under the weight. The fort had accepted him 16 times. This time, it held him. What happened at Cushion's Ford did not make a clean story. It came fast and close and ugly. Boots sliding on wet stone, breath going ragged, the sudden animal sounds men made when they were surprised by pain. Double Wrong's men were wrong in their serving and wrong in their taking, but they were still men with faces and panic and blood that looked like anybody else's when it hit the water. When it was over, some of the 12 were sick behind the bank, emptying themselves into a creek like their bodies were trying to throw the whole act back out. Ott let them be sick. Chapter 8. The Accounting. They brought Double Wrong before the hollow. They did not bring his men. There were no men to bring. What came up the road was only Cushion himself, kept on his feet by will and by the hollow's hands. They set him in the road where the hollow had cried out in the dark. The hollow people watched him and felt the strange mixture of it, satisfaction with the cost and the sickening knowledge that the cost had been paid in bodies. Ott opened the De Beer copies. He worked through the pages slowly. He said what the words did, who benefited, who bled. The paper said the company didn't own what it claimed. The taking had been rotten from the first signature, and the rot had a name and a face in the hollow for 8 years. The hollow listened without moving. Double Wrong listened the way a man listened when the only remaining question was whether he would be allowed to leave. When the recording was done, Ott looked at him a long moment. Then he stepped aside, clearing the road south. Double Wrong met his eyes. He said nothing. He turned and started south down the Two Rivers Road by himself, uneven in his step, the hollow watching him go as if the road itself were sending a message he would have had to carry back to whoever had paid him to come. Then Dora, standing at her gate, said, "Well?" Silence held the road after that. You could hear the creek. You could also hear the absence where the 6 men had been. Then the hollow laughed, not because what had happened was funny, but because breath returned to bodies that had been braced for 8 years. Some of them made the sound and cried at the same time. Relief and grief came together. Ott stayed in the road and let it move through him. The laughter, the crying, the shaking that came after men did a thing they could not undo. The spirit was still there, quiet and weighty, enough to keep him from tipping into triumph, enough to keep him from tipping into despair, enough to keep him standing while the hollow learned what freedom cost and what it required next. Chapter 9. The 40 years. He judged the hollow for 40 years. This did not mean what the county seat meant by judge. It meant that when the hollow had a dispute it could not settle, the people brought it to Ott, and Ott sat with them and heard them out and asked the questions that needed asking and found, in most cases, where the truth was. Not always where either party expected it, but there, if he had the patience and the honesty to look. He had both. The 8 years had given him patience, and the creek had given him honesty. Or perhaps the honesty had always been there, and the creek had simply confirmed it. He kept the documents from De Beer and used them where they could be used, and found over the years that they could be used in more places than he had expected. The county seat was not fixed. The men in it changed. A document that found no traction in the second year found different traction in the 10th in the hands of a commissioner who had not been in Double Wrong's employment and had his own reasons for caring about the contradiction between 2 sets of deeds. The law moved slow. The hollow was patient. It had learned patience the hard way and decided to keep the skill once it acquired it. Most of the 40 years didn't look like deliverance. It looked like small problems brought into the light. People brought him disputes about landlines and water rights, whose field the creek fed first on a dry summer, The line between two homesteads agreed on by two grandfathers and now contested by two grandsons who had not inherited their grandfather's capacity for agreement. They brought him disputes about debt, what had been borrowed and what had been repaid, and what the terms were. The terms having been verbal and therefore existing in two different forms and two different memories. They brought him disputes about inheritance, which were the most difficult because inheritance disputes were always about something other than the thing they appeared to be about. The camp meetings came back, not right away. The first summer after the ford, there was only the Hollow's own Sunday gathering, held in the road where the crying out had happened, which seemed right. But the second summer, a preacher came up from the valley, and the crowd was large. And the summer after that, two preachers came, and singing returned to the households, the way warmth returned after a long cold spell, tentative at first, then sure, then finally full-throated and unself-conscious, and people remembering they were allowed. The young ones grew up not knowing what the 8 years had been. This was the right outcome and also a strange one, because children without the memory of tribute was the whole point of the ford and the 40 years. Strange because the people who had lived through it carried something the young ones did not and could not fully communicate. The gap was not resentment. The older ones were glad the young ones didn't carry it. The gap was just there, the untransferable knowledge of what a particular kind of hard had felt like from the inside. Caleb lived to see most of it. He died in the 15th year, old beyond what seemed possible, in his own bed in the upper hollow, with Aksha at one side and Odd at the other. He had been failing for a month and then failing faster, and then one morning simply further away than he had been the morning before, the distance increasing daily until the distance was complete. His last words were from the Psalms, which was appropriate and was also just Caleb. He said them clearly, closed his eyes, and that was the last thing he said. It was a good last thing. The hollow buried him on the ridge at the high point above the creek, where on a clear day you could see across three valleys, which was the view Caleb had always said he preferred, the high view, the long sight, the ability to see where things were going rather than only where they were. Ott stood at the grave and felt what 40 years of judgment felt like from the inside. Not glory, not the sustained elevation of the ford, not the wide-eyed stranger at the creek or the spirit closing the circuit in the road at the sunrise. These were events. What 40 years felt like from inside was the long ordinary that surrounded the events. The daily showing up, the disputes heard, the questions asked, the slow work of the De Beer documents moving through a changing county seat, the Sunday gatherings in the road, the camp meetings, the seed court planted each spring in ground that no longer owed a portion of itself to the Two Rivers Valley, the accumulated weight of ordinary faithfulness, the unremarkable texture of a life lived in service to people who needed what you had. It was good work. It was not always comfortable. It was the work the ancient days had given him at the creek in the early morning, and he had done it, and it had been worth doing. Aksha's hand found his at the graveside. He held it. 40 years, and it had started with two words thrown into the ridge air. Liturgy of the Road. Ancient of days, I am an ordinary man from a hollow in the mountains who went to the creek one morning and found something there. I want to say I was ready. I was not. I had not been ready for 8 years. And I would like to tell myself that was wisdom waiting on you, but you know me well enough to know it was also fear. The honesty is more useful than the flattery now. You came to the creek. You put your feet on the bank and left the marks. You said, go. I will be with you. I went. You were with me. That is the account. The 40 years after were the answer to Dora saying how long at her gate by the road. I was glad to be the one to carry the answer, though carrying it required me to become a different kind of man than the man who expected to spend his life farming. The creek is still running. I go down in the mornings and stand in shallows, and the stones are just stones now, cold and ordinary and good. I look for the marks sometimes. The grass has grown back. I know where they were, and the knowing is enough. I'm grateful for the ordinary morning and the cold water and the grass growing back. This is what 40 years of peace looks like from the inside. This is everything.